Julie, I know that when we recorded our first podcast episode with JT Taylor, you weren't able to join us due to scheduling conflicts, but I know that both of us were marked JT's episode last year as one of our favorites, and I was excited for you to get to meet JT in preparation for our podcast recording.
Absolutely. And I was so sad to have missed the first, but I think today he just changed my mindset in so many different ways. I've always said I'm the least political person out there. And I think sometimes we get ourselves wrapped around politics in a way that isn't a productive mindset. And I'm just so excited because I think he's given me so many different productive ideas to consider as I go forward and really, through the balance of this year and ultimately into next year, an election year, which will be even more interesting.
It's funny, Julie, over my 35-year career now, I've worked with professional money managers, primarily from Wellington Management Company and then from Schroders. What always kind of amazed me about them is that no matter where they stood politically as an individual, they were almost always able to park those emotions and opinions to look at markets rationally. And I think one of the things I took from our conversation with JT Taylor is the need to do that, regardless of how we feel about certain things. Now, maybe some financial professionals are saying, no way, I can't do that. But in a sense, if you can separate your emotions from a rational assessment of what's actually going on, I think you can be a real resource to your clients.
I agree wholeheartedly, and tune out those headlines. I think that was the other thing that I took from it, just a very simple action item. So, well, today we have JT Taylor, who serves as Senior Policy Analyst at Hedgeye Potomac Research. Prior to joining Potomac Research Group, he ran Polaris Research, the U.S. Public Markets division of Holdingham Group based in the U.K. JT has worked extensively in both government and business in Washington, D.C., with experience that spans both the legislative and executive branches, as well as in a D.C.-based consulting firm that he founded with Secretary Jack Kemp in 2002.
So, Julie, let's hear from JT Taylor. Hi, I'm John.
And I'm Julie.
We're the hosts of the Hartford Fund's Human-Centric Investing Podcast.
Every other week, we're talking with inspiring thought leaders to hear their best ideas for how you can transform your relationships with your clients.
Let's go.
Well, welcome, JT, to our Human-Centric Investing Podcast. We're delighted to be here with you today.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for having me. This is my favorite part of the week.
So, JT, you were on with us just prior to the election in 2022. And as you know, I've started the JT Taylor fan club because if anybody goes back and listens to that episode, both Julie and I were amazed at how accurate you were. But that's why we're back today. It kind of like we could all exhale after that election, right? We could all get our groundings again, and maybe we wouldn't hear about elections again for another year until 2024. But I know in talking with you've kind of informed us that's probably not going to be the case. So really what we wanted to have you on today to talk to us about was update us about where things stand now that the election results of 2022 are known.
Yeah, and again, John, Julie, thanks for having me. This is really fun for me, believe it or not. I really enjoy this engagement with you guys. So we're in 2023. Congress is just being seated. We had a bit of a delay on Capitol Hill, given McCarthy's, shall we say, run for the speakership. And so with that, Congress is getting a late start getting started. The committees are just up and running. The agendas are still being vetted. I mean, there's just a lot of legwork that needs to be done. And a lot of this is done in December prior to being elected, the formal election for speaker. And of course, the swearing in of the members. So we're in February now, and just it's going to be a little tight, John. I mean, we talked about this during the third quarter and fourth quarter of 2022, where you've got a divided Congress. We were looking at a divided Congress, an election year in another year, and everybody sort of jockeying and posturing for that. I don't believe that there's going to be, I mean, is there going to be serious legislation considered? Of course. But a lot of the legislation we're going to see coming from the House and the Senate, both parties are going to be guilty of this, is messaging. It's not and again, I'm not trying to diminish it, but it's not a serious attempt at legislating right now. It's a play to their constituencies, and for their reelection bids, and to make sure that their core is and their base is with them time and again. I think where you're going to see a lot of angst again is around the 3 or 4 things that need to get done. That's the debt ceiling, number one. Number two, that's passing a budget. 3, we have a farm bill that needs to be renewed, and that's going to be critical to our economy. And then there are defense and other supplemental issues, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's natural disasters that need to be tackled. Those are going to be the uncertainties that will need to bipartisan support throughout the year. But we've discussed this before. When it comes to the legislative part of this, and as I said, the messaging, the fringes are going to drive this on both sides of the aisle. And so what I admonish or encourage maybe everyone to do is, you don't want to ignore the fringes, but pay attention to the center, pay attention to the big issues and where there is common ground with both parties. That's not a lot. Having said that, there's not a lot of common ground right now, but we're looking at 2024. And just as we have divided government now, with the Republicans holding the House, the Democrats holding the Senate, that could easily flip in 2024. And that's not something that happens historically. You can have the House turn Democrat. Remember, John, we talked about this right around the election, where there are, I think, 18 Republicans right now that are sitting in Biden plus Biden districts, very pro-Biden or Democrat districts, if you will. And those people are on the fence. That could go either way. And in fact, I think 11 of those 18 seats are in New York and California, not the reddest states in the union, by the way. So just as easily as the House flipped to Republicans, it could flip back to the Democrats in 2024. Conversely, on the Senate side, 33 to 34 seats, a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. And this year, Democrats have 20 seats to defend of those 33 or 34. And some of those are in red states. So they've got a really big uphill battle to keep the Senate. Not impossible. The last 2 cycles, McConnell thought he was going to be the majority leader. It comes back to candidate quality at the end of the day, and we saw where that went. But you can bet that McConnell and some of the more mainstream Republicans are going to have or will want to have a bigger say in who the nominees are. They're not going to want this chance to take the Senate back, slip through their fingers again.
Well, JT, and I think in regards to your comment there, if you think about it, I think I have this right. The Republican majority in the House is 4 seats, right? And you could say it's those 4 New York seats, right? Which, as you mentioned, were Biden districts in 2020. And I think the majority of those, not by a little, like by a lot. So I don't envy Kevin McCarthy having to deal with, we hear a lot about the conservative wing of the Republican Party, but really he's got to be thinking about those legislators that are actually giving him the majority as well, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get to this. I know we've got to talk about the debt ceiling here in a second, but we'll get to it. We'll talk a little bit more about the debt ceiling. But when you think about it, you've got the 4 in New York. You've got a number of them in 6 or 7 more in California. And these are just the newly elected ones. There are probably another dozen, shall we say, moderates. I mean, it's kind of hard to be a moderate in the Republican Party without, the name calling starting. But so there are probably around 20 to 25 moderates, maybe more, that McCarthy is going to have to keep his eye on, and that's not an easy bunch. Again, we've seen what the Tea Party, as sort of this far right element, has brought to the equation. I don't believe that the moderate Republicans, or I don't know if you want to call them endangered Republicans, but they're not going to sit in their hands during this debate. So McCarthy really has to straddle the two. And then there are the mainstream conservatives in the middle, and it all comes down to on both sides of the aisle, what tail is wagging the dog. Is it going to be the far right or the far left tail? And I think just sort of going back a second to the first 2 years of the Biden administration, we all thought, and many out there would probably posit that the liberals dominated the first 2 years. But when you think about it, and think about Ocasio-Cortez and some of these others, we'll talk about infrastructure in a second, but we had a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill, just over $1 trillion in infrastructure spending. Some of these progressives were calling for 5 to 10 trillion in infrastructure spending. Untenable. It's impossible to get through in DC. And so he kept them at bay for the most part. The agenda was driven by the liberal wing, but now we're in a different paradigm here with McCarthy and his right wing, and it's all going to depend on how much they control the agenda and control the party in the House. And early signs are that he's really done a good job in the first couple of weeks, sort of navigating these shoals. I do think that the tougher tests are ahead of him. Again, as you said, there's a four-seat majority. You've got the George Santos problem looming, so no one knows where that's going to head. And then you did have unfortunately, you had a member of Congress in Florida take a pretty nasty spill from a ladder back in mid-January. And so with the end of proxy voting, he's got pretty much a 3-seat margin here in the coming weeks. So a really tough battle for McCarthy, but even tougher when it comes to these big issues and keeping that right wing at bay.
JT, it's interesting as you rattle off all of these examples. It makes me think about headlines. And I counted on my phone over the weekend, just the news app alone, the number of updates. There were 37 of them in 48 hours on my phone. And as I sit here and think about a financial professional fielding calls from clients and proactively reaching out to clients, of course, as we are in the throes of tax season and have continued market volatility, all of these headlines and how they're noise and they cloud our minds. If we think about some of the key issues that we can arm financial professionals with to discuss with clients proactively, even if maybe they're not on the same side of the political coin, if you will, how would we start to synthesize that? You mentioned the debt ceiling. Maybe that's a great way to kick off our conversation, but just in thinking about some of those areas that we could provide those talking points and those updates, and maybe some great explanation and background for clients as well, because my guess is even as educated and intelligent as we all are, the headlines can tend to grab and tug at our emotions, and then maybe we're not thinking clearly, and that obviously can have a significant ramifications on our portfolios and our asset allocation and ultimately decisions that we're making about our future just based upon things that are popping up on our phone on any given day.
Yeah. And again, I hope this isn't going to come across the wrong way, but I say ignore the fringes first and foremost. On the Republican side, there was a call for a national sales tax that the Democrats were making light of, eliminating income taxes. Whether we agree with this or not, it's just untenable right now, and it's that headline risk that we refer to. Just as bad as we might need 5 to 10 trillion in infrastructure spending, Julie, but we're not going to get that at the end. It's not realistic. So try to ignore some of the headlines coming out of the more fringe elements of Congress, and they exist on both sides. This is not unique to the Republican or Democratic Party, just to make that clear. We'll get to sort of the core issues where I think Republicans and Democrats agree on, but to the debt ceiling right now, and this is straight down the center, Julie. The debt ceiling has been raised 78 times over the course of our history. Do you realize that, by the way, we're only one of 2 countries in the world that have a debt ceiling? Do you guys know who the other one is?
No.
Denmark.
No idea.
U.S. and Denmark are the only 2 countries that have a debt ceiling. Been raised 78 times in history, 49 times by Republican president, 29 times by Democratic president. It's not a partisan issue. It should be an apolitical issue. I don't believe that a budget should be negotiated on the debt ceiling. This is something that the full faith and credit of the United States, the reputation of the United States relies on. This is something that we have. Remember, John and I discussed this last week or a couple of weeks ago, back when this happened in 2011, we got really we got to the precipice of not doing it, and we were downgraded from what, AAA to AA, John, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And that really caused not so great ripples throughout the economy, not just the U.S. economy, but the world economy. The same thing could happen here. And that's not saying that we don't need to make budget cuts. And if there's one thing that's clear, after the pandemic, we've spent trillions of dollars. Some people would agree whether or not we should have spent as much as we have, but it is what it is. Both parties did it. Both presidents did it. Now we're faced with a dilemma of raising the debt ceiling and then trying to get government spending under control. And it badly needs to be under control. Just don't use the debt ceiling as a vehicle to do that. It's, again, just something that's routine, should remain routine, and shouldn't be rattling markets and shouldn't be rattling politics and politicians as it is doing right now. With that, just if I can take a second to talk about government spending, you could do that when it comes time to go through the government appropriations bills, which we will be doing this summer. When we get to the budget talks, we're going to see the Biden budget proposal soon in early March. Biden is asking the Republicans to reveal their budget. We kind of need to know what we're talking about from a budget cut standpoint, from a budgeting standpoint, before we can negotiate. Right now, we're negotiating on sort of feels like thin air, like no proposals on paper, nothing has really been discussed. I don't believe that the Democrats accusing Republicans of wanting to cut Social Security and Medicare are just. A majority of Republicans don't want to do that. This much I know. There are proposals to make changes, but again, don't pay attention to those because they're not going to make it through. But the Republicans will use that as a cudgel time and again. But the time to make budget cuts will be throughout the year through the normal routine appropriations process. And as I said earlier, we have the debt ceiling that's going to frame the beginning of the year into the summertime. And then as we get to the fall, we'll have the budget talks and sort of the government shutdown all over again. That's, while I'm not a big fan of the government shutdown, right? That's where the negotiating should be taking place, not on the debt ceiling.
So JT, we talked about divided government and how divided we really are. And some would say that's probably why the market has rallied in the early part of 2023, right? Because if they can't agree on anything, then nothing gets done. But the truth is some things have to get done. And so I was hoping you could share with us some of the issues in which there may be agreement. Maybe the Democrats and Republicans don't agree for the same reasons, but where are there areas where you think that they can come to agreement on to actually affect some legislation or take action in certain important areas? What would you say?
Yeah, aside from the big three I've mentioned, the debt ceiling, the budget, and of course the farm bill, which is coming up, and there'll be another defense authorization later in the year. I think those are the four must-pass areas. Not all with bipartisan agreement just yet, but I believe they'll get there. The other areas I think where there are commonalities are probably some big tech legislation coming down the pike. We'll have the crypto, some sort of cryptocurrency regulation or legislation. I see both parties coming together on that front. Oddly enough, and I kept my list from a previous talk in front of me because it's kind of a long list here, but China, given recent news here, China is going to be front and center in just the early part of February and the latter part of January. We had sort of 8, 9, 10 different issues, starting with TikTok. TikTok CEO is going to be appearing before Congress in I think March 23rd. Huawei is experiencing some angst on Capitol Hill. We've got we're upping our bases in the Philippines, establishing an embassy in the Solomon Islands. We had earlier in January, and you'll both remember this, General Minahan talking about an impending war or conflict with China in 2024. That was echoed by the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Mike McCall. We've got a China committee, a China Select Committee, a bipartisan China Select Committee being set up in the House right now to look at China issues. There is a bill that passed the House prohibiting China from buying oil from the Strategic Petroleum Oil Reserve. And of course, Speaker McCarthy has to go to Taiwan, or is looking to go to Taiwan, just like Pelosi did back in 2022, which, as we all know, created a lot of ruckus with the Chinese. And of course, then we had the balloon incident back in early February that's still having some ripple effects. So with that, I think China is going to be another focal point here, John. And those are the 3 or 4 areas where there are agreements. There are others, but those are the big ones that I foresee right now. I don't see much, back to the original question on as we look at 2024, and when we talked about the party switching, we could foresee in 2024, if the House hypothetically becomes Democrat again, the Senate turns Republican, and let's just say it doesn't matter who's in the White House for the time being, just for the purposes of this exercise, we still could have static policy on taxes. And of course, government spending, I think, is going to be at a standstill for the next 2-3 years. So I don't think we'll see many changes, probably some around the edges. Again, it's going to be really hard if there's divided government in 2024, 2025, and 26. It's going to be really hard to get significant tax legislation through. So we're looking at the status quo and probably potentially an expiration of the Trump tax cuts expiring in 2025. Government spending wise, again, static. I think we're looking at budget cuts for the foreseeable future.
JT, if I think about historically, it seems like in any year of an election, obviously there's a tremendous amount of activity, headlines, emotions, but it's starting to feel like an election year is bleeding into more than 1 year. And 2023 obviously feels like it's off to the same start. Would you agree with that? And what are some, if so, what are some ways that maybe financial professionals could begin to frame that with clients and sort of set expectations that, maybe this is just a teaser for what we're to expect next year, really emotionally and from a headline perspective, and et cetera?
My piece of advice: turn the TV off, turn your phone off. No, in all honesty, Julie, I mean, that's going to be a tough one. I mean, as I said, everything is messaging right now on Capitol Hill. And everything is going to be looked at through the lens of 2024. And again, appealing to the base. We're going to need to let the year play out. I do remember elections starting early, but if you think about it, we had Trump announce in December of 2022. We'll have Nikki Haley in 2023, probably 1 or 2 others in the first quarter. We're talking about 20 months of president. I want to go back to the European, and I'm going to get, I'll probably get attacked on Twitter for this, but I want to go back to like a European or Canadian system where an election is called 3 weeks before, and everything is compacted into that 3-week time. That would be heaven on earth for, I think, the American people, not to have to deal with this for 20 months. But again, I would say, stay the course again, Julie. Sort of ignore the noise on both sides of the aisle right now. Not completely, but ignore most of the noise, because I don't think we're actually going to have a nominee at least on the Republican side until early 20 or mid 2024. It's just not, with as many candidates are getting in with as much uncertainty that's out there. It's anybody's guess who's going to win that. Should Biden announce, and many expect he will, and be the standard bearer, again, just go back a second. Neither party is happy with the lead frontrunner of their parties right now. They want fresh blood here. I think the country needs fresh blood here. That's sort of, I'm off on a bit of a tangent here, but with that. We could be looking at a rematch of 2020 again, the 2020 race, and Julie, I don't know. From a congressional standpoint, I think we're headed for divided government for a couple more years. So I would just look at not a lot getting done in Congress. And I think from our standpoint, that does bode well that Congress, that the markets aren't looking over their shoulder constantly for attacks coming from Washington. There are going to be pieces of legislation. This is going to be the year and maybe 2 years of regulation. If Biden can't legislate, and it's going to be really tough to legislate, he's going to regulate. And so you are going to see more regulations on industry. But typically, the country wants to see they want to see the problems getting solved. But I think the markets don't mind divided government. And I think we're headed for that for a couple more years.
JT, I know, we talked about headlines just a moment ago in our conversation. And I know Julie and I and our team have a presentation called Media Replay that oftentimes is high in demand, especially in election years, because we're trying to educate people that emotions, and when you think about politics, there may not be a more emotional topic. Emotions and investing usually don't make a good mix, right? So I think for financial professionals, it's being able to take a step back with a level head and look at what's being said. And as you said, not ignore it, but most of it is probably going to be messaging into the next year. And so as I think about things that really could make a difference and maybe longer term trends, one of the issues we talked about in the 2022 election that I think some thought were going to be the number one issue, at least it was going to be a high priority issue, is immigration. And since we've last talked, we've seen a number of things come out about China's population is shrinking. Western Europe, especially Italy, as an example, population is shrinking. And nobody really thinks about the long-term devastation that this brings, especially if you're in a country that restricts immigration or doesn't have a good path of immigration. And so I guess from the inside DC standpoint, is anything productive going to happen on immigration, or is it such a hot button issue where people just see the headline and that's all they take from it, so nobody wants to touch it?
There are going to be attempts, John, and probably many attempts to tackle this conundrum. I'm surprised that the Biden administration hasn't jumped on this from day one. I mean, this is something that when they had the House and the Senate, again, the Senate by one vote, I think he should have taken a much more aggressive approach on. And I think the time has, and I'm hoping to be wrong here, John, but I think the time has passed for significant immigration legislation. When you had unified government, it would have, again, not easy given the numbers and the margins the Democrats had, the very slim margin. Remember, Pelosi has the same four-seat margin, had the same four-seat margin that McCarthy has right now. And again, Schumer only had a 50-50 Senate, and Kamala Harris broke that tie. Really tough to get done the first 2 years, but again, surprised that it didn't happen. I'd be even more surprised if the parties could come together a year before an election to get it done. With that, it really is a crisis. It's reached a point that the point of no return, in my opinion. I think you make some really valid points on trying to get this done. It's going to take muscle, and it's going to take a lot of courage from the center once again to get this done. There is for example, you've got a member of Congress on the far right that wants to negotiate immigration on the debt ceiling. Come on, I mean, this is not something that should even be considered. So these are the things that you're going to have to navigate in this Congress to get it done. It's going to take real leadership, and I personally don't believe in courage, and I personally don't believe it exists. I think there are going to be some attempts. There are going to be fits and starts. We might have some minor legislation getting through there, but it surely needs to be done, and I just don't think the numbers are there on Capitol Hill, sadly.
It's interesting, JT. I've heard you mention a centrist approach, and I think that that's really an interesting mindset, finding those common causes, even if they're for slightly different reasons. And I think for a financial professional, that's just such a great mindset to have when having conversations with clients. Could you share with us a few more thoughts on that sort of centrist mindset that you've mentioned, just how you think about it, and maybe some good guidelines for that for financial professionals?
First and foremost, ignore the extremes. We talked about this earlier. You can't pay attention to the shiny objects on each side of the aisle. They're going to be there with that massive, multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure spend, or they're going to be on the other side of the aisle with that 35% national sales tax. Untenable. Ignore it. As much as we want to gravitate and pay attention to those stories, ignore them, because they're just not steeped in reality. One, two, I'm not helping the stock prices of some of the social media giants here, but stay off of social media as much as possible. I mean, it really is. We're just constantly bombarded by this stuff, and we've become a very tribal nation, as you've heard this term used time and again. And so when we're on social media, we tend to look at like-minded news outlets or like-minded social media outlets or what have you. I would just recommend you staying off there. Not going to win any friends out there, and just focus on. I think maybe this is going to sound a little trite, but focus on what's the art of the possible, right? And what is realistic in Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, there's not a lot right now that's possible. And we've been through a couple of these issues right now. But I've found that staying and sort of ignoring the news networks on whatever you watch, and staying off of social media as much as possible. And there's just there are a few pieces I think I may have mentioned. Congress Daily, again, not something you guys want to read out there because it will put you to sleep in 5 minutes, but just trying to look at the issues out there and not listen to the fringes with the megaphones. When you think about this, John and Julie, the fringes have them. We didn't have to deal with this as much 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now that these more extreme elements are on social media, they have a megaphone. And unfortunately for our friends in the news industry, or unfortunately for us, our friends in the news industry gravitate to those with the megaphones because they make headlines. That's what sells newspapers. That's what sells clicks at the end of the day. And so ignore that. Easier said than done.
JT, one last question from me. We talked about the danger of making decision by headlines, but I, and Julie had a conversation where we talked about legislation has already been passed. Money is being spent. You may not like the level of spending. You may have disagreed with it, but whether you liked it or not, it's happening. But we always tell advisors, to a certain extent, you do have to look for silver linings, right? You have to look for positive messages because there's plenty of negative out there to fill everybody's heads. But one thing you mentioned was the CHIPS bill that passed last year. And there is a silver lining in that. In fact, I think if most Americans heard about some of the things that are happening, they might actually appreciate what's going on. But would you share with our audience, just as an example, kind of what's happening as a result of the passage of that CHIPS bill last year?
Yeah, I mean, and I had a discussion with a senior member of the military, retired member of the military, back in December on this front. And I said, look, this $40 billion in CHIPS legislation, in semiconductor legislation, went through, much ballyhooed by the Democrats and some Republicans, and of course President Biden. What gives? Is this legit? Is this going to make a dent? And is it needed? And he just point blank said, JT, 100%. It's a dent. It's a start, and we're already behind the 8 ball. But it's about time that we got this we got this started, or else we'd really be behind the Chinese in the coming decades. So definitely a positive sign, not just from a strategic or geopolitical standpoint, but also from a jobs creation standpoint, onshoring, a less reliance on China and other foreign entities for some of this technology. So I tend to listen to some of these senior military types, And when they say that it was a step in the right direction, not solved, by the way, by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely a big step in the right direction. But John, there's also $3 trillion in additional spending that's still out there floating in the economy that still hasn't been spent from the early COVID days. Also, the infrastructure bill, that money is going to hit the economy and starting to hit the economy. We're seeing projects in your states and here in the DC region. And then you also have the investment, the Inflation Recovery Act that passed last year. Agree with it or not, that's going to work its way into the economy. So it's about, as I said, about $3 trillion making its way through the economy. And then I just read this morning that states have a $136.8 billion rainy day fund. So 136.8 billion in rainy day fund monies out there. So states are in pretty good shape. That was in the Journal this morning. So states are in pretty good shape as well. So yes, there is talk of a soft landing. Yes, there is talk of a debt ceiling impasse or government shutdown. But from a positive standpoint, $3 trillion in there. Again, potentially inflationary at times, and so I'll save that for the economists. But a fact is a fact. There's money out there, and it's making its way through the economy. And specific to the CHIPS bill, it's having an impact.
I used to work for a guy who would tell us that it's amazing what we would accomplish if we just didn't care who got the credit.
Yeah, 100%. Oh, God.
So, JT, you've been with us on the Human Centric podcast before, and you know that one of Julie and my favorite segments is what we call the lightning round. And so we talked a lot today about division and commonality. We'll see if we can maybe share some things in common with you based on your responses to our questions. So if you're ready, let's rock. My first question is dark chocolate or milk chocolate?
Oh, God. I mean, dark chocolate. Oh, God. Dark chocolate, I eat periodically because it's better for you than milk chocolate, but I like milk chocolate better.
There you go. That's a definite milk chocolate.
JT, what's the ideal outside temperature?
Oh, 70 degrees.
JT, are you an iPhone guy or an Android guy?
iPhone only because everything clicks.
Do you prefer a paper to-do list or a digital one?
Oddly enough, I have both. But I do prefer the paper.
All right, similar to the chocolate question, Coke or Pepsi? Worlds apart.
Neither. I don't drink soda.
Well, there you go.
But I probably would drink Coke if I had to pick one or the other.
If you had a chance to take your spouse on a long weekend, what would be your favorite U.S. city to do that in?
Favorite city would probably be Carmel, California. Carmel by the sea.
It's beautiful. Good pick.
Yeah, amazing. Plus, I'd get some golf in.
Speaking of travel, what's one item you can't leave home without?
Probably my phone.
Yeah, good answer. And all sports considered, JT, what's your favorite sports team?
Pittsburgh Steelers. I think they're back there somewhere.
There you go.
Do you prefer to shop online or go to the store?
Online. I don't like going into stores, and I don't know when the last time I was in a shopping mall. So online is my savior.
I'm going to put you in the Wayback Machine, JT. What was your favorite board game as a child?
Monopoly.
Good pick. Did you win?
I did always, almost always. Little rivalry with my younger brother.
I was going to say you created a lot of family wars then.
Very competitive family. Everything.
I was always the banker. JT, are you spontaneous? Are you spontaneous or are you a planner?
A planner with a spontaneous streak. And I just don't like surprises, but yeah, I'm a planner.
Would you rather binge a TV show or watch a movie?
Binge.
Any
I'm
favorites?
binging Slow Horses right now, which to me means like an episode a night. So it's an Apple Plus. Have you guys seen it?
I have not, but
Yeah.
the whole binging thing kind of sneaks up on me because my binging is like an episode and a half before I fall asleep at night. I don't make it much past 9:30. It doesn't work well with binging.
Yeah, and I have to wait for
That's
really bad weather, so I can't stand being indoors. So I have to wait for snowstorms, cold, or rain.
fair enough. It makes sense. Are you a tea or a coffee person?
Coffee.
And one last one for you, JT. Do you prefer texting or phone conversations, which I guess is pretty important in your business?
I prefer texting.
Hmm.
Lots of phone conversations, but texting. If I could get something done, texting without a long conversation, long back and forth, texting easily.
Well, JT, we can't thank you enough for joining us today and helping us shift our mindset to finding commonalities. For our listeners, you can access JT's commentary by visiting hartfordfunds.com/politics and take a peek at his newest article, Washington Divided: What to Watch. Thanks again, JT, for all of your insight and education today.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, John.
Thanks for listening to the Hartford Funds Human-Centric Investing Podcast. If you'd like to tune in for more episodes, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube.
And if you'd like to be a guest and share your best ideas for transforming client relationships, email us at guestbooking@hartfordfunds.com. We'd love to hear from you.
Talk to you soon.
The views and opinions expressed herein are those of our featured guests who are not affiliated with Hartford Funds.